In life, we all encounter obstacles, and those obstacles come in all different shapes, sizes, and forms. The question is, how do we handle those obstacles? Do we attack them head on, or do we allow them to make us quit? Welcome to the No Quit Living podcast, where we aim to motivate and inspire listeners to never give up on themselves, their dreams, or their goals. We will interview successful people from all walks of life as they share their no-quit stories when they had the choice to give up or give in, but they didn't. We thank you for listening, and we hope to be that jolt of positivity as you go for your greatness. Welcome to episode number 195 of the No Quit Living podcast. I'm your host, Christopher J. Worth, and today's theme of the day is possibility. Our quote of the day comes to us from Thomas Edison. When you have exhausted all possibilities, remember this: you haven't. Today's episode is sponsored by the good people over at West Fair Communications, who publish the Westchester County Business Journal and the Fairfield County Business Journal. These newspapers do a wonderful job in covering all aspects of the business world within two of the most influential markets in the New York metropolitan area. You can also take advantage of their daily news feeds, which keep track on the companies and thought leaders in these important regions. For more information, take a look at www.westfaironline.com. Trust me, once you start reading, you won't quit. I'm really glad to be able to bring you today's show. I've been a fan of our guest for quite some time, and I've really enjoyed her books. Her new book, Juliet's School of Possibilities, is a quick read that's filled with some really important life advice. Laura Vanderkam is an incredible author and a time management and productivity expert. I hope you enjoy today's episode. Laura, I'd like to welcome you to the No Quit Living podcast. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. So the first question we ask everybody is, are you ready to bring it today?
Of course, always ready.
The number one objective of our podcast is to motivate and inspire our listeners to never give up. And I was curious if you had either a personal story of perseverance or perhaps a really challenging time that tested you and you could have given up or given in, but you didn't.
Yeah, well, I write books about time management and productivity, but there's always the question of how you get that first book to write about this topic. And many years ago, when I was exploring writing a book on this topic, it took me a really, really long time to get a book contract. A proposal went through multiple iterations. Like, no one seemed to be interested. About 19 months between when I started thinking about writing about this topic and then finally got someone to give me a book deal, which, seemed like a long time in the middle of it, and wondered, well, is it worth continuing with this? But I'm glad I did, because I've really enjoyed now spending the past 10 years or so writing about the topic and multiple books on it. So I'm really glad that I did not quit in the middle of that.
So speaking of the topic, how did you get into this topic? I think it's such a fascinating topic and something that we speak about not only on our show, but also from the stage as well. I'm just curious as how you got into it.
I think I've probably always been interested in productivity. Looking back on my life, I've enjoyed reading self-help books. But when I became a parent for the first time about 12 years ago, certainly the way I viewed time changed quite a bit. I had to be more accountable for my time as one of the major shifts. Any of your listeners who've been through that transition can appreciate that. And so, I wanted to see how other people were combining career and family responsibilities and making time for their own pursuits as well. And so I began studying how people spent their time, and my interest came out of that.
I think it's remarkable that you touch on that topic, because it's something that I think every single person has to deal with at some point in life. And I think as a parent myself, definitely having your first child totally changes things, because now all of a sudden your time, which everybody's is limited, now becomes even more limited. And I think one of the things we talk about is time maximization, because the reality is we still have those same 24 hours. We just have to, I guess, manage it and maximize it. But I wanted to just change lanes for a minute, Laura, and I wanted to ask you, what does success look like, or what does success mean to you?
Success to me means I'm spending as much of my time as possible on the things that I find meaningful and enjoyable. So certainly at work, I'm always hoping to find new and different and challenging projects that make me feel energized. And same thing on the home front, when I'm having a good time with my family, when I am doing my hobbies as well, then I feel like life is going well.
No, I couldn't agree more with that. And I was talking to you before we went live. Your new book, Juliet's School of Possibilities, is remarkable. I just finished it this past week, and I took so much from it. And I was just curious, what was the inspiration behind the book? And I love the word possibilities as well.
So I've written how people can spend their time better in many books, and talked about this for years in speeches. But I've noticed that no one would ever come up to me after a speech and be like, "Yeah, that statistic you had on the fourth slide, that was just like life changing for me." So it was always that I told some story that people remembered and then could cite back to me, often most of the details, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. Why does the human brain hold on to stories so well when many other things we have no ability to hold on to whatsoever? And it's just that people like stories. Stories are how we like our information, how we've historically gotten our information, through the form of stories. So I decided to turn my writings, what I've been teaching, into a story. And my publisher was also looking to do some more books in this genre of fables that teach a lesson. They've done many of the successful ones that have been out there over the years, and so they were looking to commission some more. So we worked something out, and Juliet's School of Possibilities is the result.
No, and I love that word possibility, and obviously it means so much in the time management world. But is it something that means a lot to you, or was it just something that you wanted to write about in regards to with your publisher?
So I view possibilities as this exciting way of viewing the future. If you think about it, all time in the future is open. Eventually we will be on the next side of the following 168 hours. Eventually it will be this time next year. But the time between then and now is blank. It will be filled with what we choose to do with it. And how cool is life when you see that as being about possibilities, as opposed to things that you are being, forced on you, or feel like they're being forced on you. And so Juliet's School of Possibilities is a tale of, an ambitious young consultant whose life is falling apart on various dimensions because she has no ability to choose what is the right thing to do with her time. And she goes to this place called Juliet's School of Possibilities, where she meets this mentor figure, Juliet, who shows her different possibilities for her life based on what sort of choices she makes. And it really gets Riley thinking about what possible outcomes she'd like for her life, and where to envision herself in the future. If she was successful in all senses of the word, what would her life look like? What is possible for her? And then once you see possible for you, you can start to ask yourself what steps you can make in the here and now to get there.
No, I really enjoyed how you used the fable to tell that story. And one of the things that really stood out to me in your book is when you wrote about you always have time for what matters. I kind of want to just dig into that for a minute, and what got you kind of focusing on that, because I think in our podcast, as well as with our company, we always talk about excuses versus results. You can't have both. So I think it falls into the same, you always have time for what matters. And I just wanted to see if you could expand on that for a minute.
Yeah, so I'm not saying that certain people's lives aren't more difficult than others, and we should have empathy with people of why they're making certain choices, and it usually is because something can't be a priority right now because other things more immediately need to be. But I think in the long run, we can choose to expand the amount of time that we spend on the things that are priorities for us. What I always like to tell a story in my speeches of a lady who is tracking her time for me. I've had thousands of people track their time for me over the years. And she was a very busy woman. And the particular week she tracked, she went out for a Wednesday night for something. And she came home to find that her water heater had broken. And so there was water all over her basement, which is always this huge homeowner disaster when this happens. And so she had to deal with it. Her time logs showed her dealing with the water, getting the plumbers, the cleaning crew, all this stuff. And it took 7 hours of her week, which, if you think about it, is a fair chunk of time. But we sort of talked about this in the workshop afterward and said, if we talked about this at the start of the week and said, like, hey, can you find 7 hours to set up those coffee dates with the people who keep asking you to mentor them at work, or 7 hours to start working on that book you keep saying you want to write? Would you have been able to find the time? And of course, everyone knows, like, the answer is no. Of course, we'd say I can't find 7 hours to do these things because we're all so busy. But when she had to find 7 hours, because there's water all over her basement, she found those 7 hours. And so I think this is instructive, because when something big happens, when there's an emergency, when there's, a crisis, you find the time to deal with it. But where did that time come from? I mean, you didn't make other time. It's just you took it away from something that it turned out didn't truly have to happen that week. And so I challenge people to treat what matters to them as the equivalent of that broken water here, right? And you can decide to get to it and treat it with that level of urgency.
No, I think that's so key that you touched on that. And maybe a tough question, but for any of our listeners that are looking to maybe improve their time management, is your best suggestion for them to track their time for a week, or what would be something for them to do that they could take their time management to a little bit of a better place?
Well, I certainly think that tracking your time for a week is a great way to spend your time better, and probably is the first step people should take. I know it sounds difficult and not so fun, but the reason to do it is that it gives you good data. I mean, how can you make a decision about what needs to be changed if you aren't working for good data? I mean, you wouldn't open a store in a new place without looking at, what's selling and what that neighborhood is like. I mean, you want good data for business decisions. Same thing with time, because maybe something you think is a problem really isn't. And maybe something you haven't even thought of is taking way more time than you might have imagined. I certainly see this in time logs all the time. Many people are convinced that the problem is that they are working way too many hours. Sometimes that is a problem. Sometimes it's actually not the problem, though, right? Their work hours are within reason. They tend to remember their worst days as typical. But maybe it's something else. Maybe it's that the kind of work they're doing is stressful or, difficult in a way that they aren't able to deal with. And maybe they'd like to be doing something different that they would find more energizing. It's not about the hours, it's what you're doing within it. Or maybe it's that, they can't remember what they're doing in their personal lives because they're sort of not doing fun, meaningful stuff in their personal life. And consequently, work seems to expand because there's nothing else in life that also seems to be taking time. So these are all different matters than the sheer number of hours you're working. Or, something for me, I used to think I spent like no time in the car whatsoever because I work out of my home office, so I don't have a daily commute. And for many people, their daily commute is the bulk of the time they spend in their car. So I don't have that. So therefore, time in the car must be negligible. And then I started tracking my time continuously, like 4 years ago. I've actually been tracking my time for 4 years, which no one needs to do, but I did. And I found I spend on average about an hour a day in the car, which is not nothing. Like, it's more time than I spend exercising, for instance. And what it is there were a lot of short trips. And because they were short, they weren't really registering in my brain, but they definitely are happening. And so it's good to think about, well, am I using that time for things? Am I noticing if I'm driving children and trying to interact with them? That would be a good way to turn that into some quality relationship time. Or if I'm by myself, maybe I should be listening to, podcasts or audiobooks or things with a little bit more intention than just like turning on top 40 radio, which I don't really even like anyway.
It's interesting that you touched on the time logs. I'm working with one of my clients now just on the concept of when she goes to bed and when she wakes up. And she's been tracking her time for the last week or so. And to your point of when you tracked how much time you were in the car and you found out it was about an hour a day, I think it's really important because what you said really hit home with me is when you actually look at that, at your time logs, you're creating actual facts and you're creating time, and you can actually go and say, okay, wow, so I did think I was doing this for an hour, let's say, and the reality is maybe it's double the time or maybe it's half that time. And so I think it's really important that you touch on that. I wanted to ask you a question. If you had to define yourself, but you could only use one word, what would that word be?
Curious.
That's a great word, and it's been used a couple times, but I think it means.
I'm sure it's all your. It's good, but I like to figure out the way the world works, and I like to figure out how people truly spend their time, and I like to figure out how we can spend our time better. And so, if you're, constantly in the spirit of inquiry, life is always pretty cool.
As a time management, let's say, guru, I wanted to ask you a question that we always ask each of our guests: is do you have a morning or a daily routine that you swear by?
So the one thing I would say is when people talk about daily routines, they are seldom truly daily, because most people have two chunks of time in their brains. So one is the work days and one is weekends. And so it is very, very rare that somebody has a daily routine that they actually do at the same time every day, 7 days a week. That said, I do run every single day, by which I mean 7 days a week. In late 2016, I decided to start a streak of running at least a mile a day, every day. And usually I run more than that because the first mile is the toughest. And once you run a mile, you're fine to keep going. But on the days where I'm not really feeling it, I can just run a mile, or the day is really busy, I can just run a mile. But it's been kind of good for me in terms of changing the conversation I have with myself about exercise. Don't ask, am I going to exercise today, which is some sort of, existential question of motivation, which is who knows where that leads. But the question comes, when am I going to exercise today? And that's just a matter of logistics. And so often that's an easier problem to work out.
So speaking of streaks, how many days is it?
Well, that would be at least 800 at this point. I don't know exactly because I'm not tracking it exactly, but from time to time I sort of plot it out in my brain. Well, it's been more than 2 years, and it's been a couple months more than 2 years. So it's at least 800 days by now.
So you haven't missed a day at all. That's impressive.
No.
Congrats. So if you could go back and give the 20-year-old version of yourself just one piece of advice, what would that be?
Well, I think one thing that I was really happy to learn is that you can make a living as a writer. I'm not saying that that's the only thing I do, although everything else I do comes out of the books I write. The speaking and podcasting has all come out of this idea of having ideas and sharing them through words, whether those are spoken words or written words, because really they're all the same when it comes down to it. And at 20, I didn't really know that was the case. I definitely wanted to write, but in the back of my head, I had, you need to make sure it's practical. What are the practical jobs you could have that would be associated with writing? No, you can just write books and make a living that way, which is good to know.
This might be a loaded question, but speaking of books, and you can't answer any of your books, but I was curious if you're reading anything currently or recently that you'd like to recommend to our listeners.
Well, I read a lot of books, and every month I publish a roundup on my blog of things that I've been reading. I recently read a book called The Art of Memoir by Mary Karr. I think that's how you say her name. And it was fine. It's interesting to see how people construct a memoir. But what was also fun from it is that she cited a lot of different memoirs. And so now I've just been going through and reading some of the ones that she's cited. So I read, Vladimir Nabokov's Speak Memory. I read a book called A Mathematician's Apology. I mean, it's just been all over the map. And that's kind of a fun thing to do, to read a book that lists a lot of other cool books.
No, it does. That sounds like an interesting book. I've not heard of that. And maybe a tough question to ask, but do you have an all-time favorite book?
Not really. I mean, there are certain books I've read multiple times. For instance, I really like Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. Some of her work is much less accessible as a modernist kind of writer, but To the Lighthouse is short. It's about 200 pages. It's very beautiful, very elegant, and really gets a lot of her philosophy of life and a story of how people can, in fact, change over time. And so I find myself rereading that every year or two.
No, I've not read that myself either. And you mentioned podcasts. I wanted to just ask you if you wouldn't mind just sharing a little bit about that with our listeners so they can hopefully tune in and find out a little bit more about you.
Yeah, so I actually have 2 podcasts now. The first is called Best of Both Worlds, which I co-host with a friend of mine named Sarah Hart Unger. She's a practicing physician and mom of 3. I have 4 kids. And so we talk about work and family from the perspective of people who really like both. So that's been a lot of fun to do with her. The second podcast is called Before Breakfast, and this one just launched through iHeartMedia. And it's a short, bite-sized daily productivity tip. By daily, I mean 5 days a week. I'll say that it's not 7 days a week, but it is 5. So every morning we release a new episode that's just a productivity tip that will help listeners take their day from great to awesome. And we're hoping people will kind of build this into their morning routine.
So you had to show me up. I only have 1 podcast. So you're just saying is I need to get a second?
No, you don't need to get a second. These are just both things I was very interested in doing, and they're both very, very different formats, and I enjoy them both. So I thought I'd have 2.
I wanted to touch on one thing you mentioned before, is you talked about how being an author and writing your books has led to so many of those other products and the other programs and things that you do. And I was curious if you had any advice for possibly some of our listeners that maybe are afraid of getting started or don't really know how to, in essence, get out of their own way. You just mentioned, obviously, that you launched a second podcast. What is it that allows you to just go ahead and overcome that fear and just dive into it?
Well, I mean, I enjoy creating things, and it's sort of flattering that anyone might read it or pay attention to it whatsoever. And so I'm still just so thrilled at that concept, that you can create things that other people will consume and actually enjoy consuming, and in many cases pay to consume, which is kind of fun, when you think about it. I would suggest to people just try stuff and recognize that nothing is perfect. You have to do a lot of stuff. And as you do a lot of stuff, you'll figure out what people respond to and what you do best and what you should do more of. And you'll get better because people will give you feedback and you'll say, oh, yeah, that works. And I can see why. And oh, maybe that doesn't work so well. Maybe I'll try something different. And you can't do that unless you put stuff out there. So, I always say that there's no perfect without being done. Like done is better than perfect because there isn't any perfect without being done. It's by putting stuff out in the world that you can then get better. You can't really get better in a vacuum. So you got to start somewhere. Probably would have been great to start 10, 20 years ago. But, as that saying goes, what is it? The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. So now would be a good time too.
No, I think that's great advice, and something we talk about often is the best time would have been yesterday, the next time is today, and if not, then do it tomorrow. You touched on earlier in the interview the word accountability for a minute. I wanted to just ask you, what does accountability mean to you?
Well, accountability is that I do what I have told myself I will do. And I think the person it's most important to be accountable to is yourself, because you are ultimately the one who has to live with your decisions about how you spend your time. And I know that's very difficult for some people because there's a lot of other people in the world who need things from you as well. So if you tend to respond to outer expectations more than the inner ones, it might help to get an accountability partner, for instance. Somebody that is expecting you to do things like work on that novel that you keep saying you're going to do, or start that podcast that you keep saying you want to do. And this person can call you up every week and say, hey, where is it? Where is it? You haven't done it yet. Where is it? And otherwise make themselves very annoying until you actually do it.
No, I love that you touched on the accountability part, and that's something that we're big fans of. And I often talk about that because it's something that you can do at work, you can do personally, you can do professionally. And like you said, is you obviously need to be accountable to yourself first, but you're not going to call yourself up and have a conversation with yourself as you would with somebody who's going to call you up or email you or have that in person or over video conversation. Say, hey, you were supposed to do these things. Did you get them done?
Exactly. Yeah, no, I would definitely recommend that technique.
So wanted to ask you interesting question. If I could give you the opportunity to have dinner with anybody, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
Well, since I mentioned that I enjoyed Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, I think it would be interesting to have dinner with her. And given that she was part of that whole Bloomsbury group in London back in the 1920s or so, very fascinating group of people. I'm sure she was a interesting person to have dinner with, in fact. So that might be fun.
And I have to ask this question as an author. We're big fans of quotes. I wanted to just ask if you have an all-time favorite quote.
Probably the one I cite most is one I use in my own work all the time from a lady who I interviewed about her own productivity. But she basically said that I don't have time really means it's not a priority. And every time I catch myself thinking, oh, I don't have time to do X, I'm like, no, X is not a priority. And if that is true, it is true. And we should just own that truth, right? Because there's no use pretending that the situation is any different from that. And there may be very good reasons that X is not a priority at this particular time in life. But if it's not true, that X really is a priority, then you owe it to yourself to make the time for it. So I really love that phrase as a way of keeping myself accountable, and a lot of other people have found that it helps them stay accountable too.
I love that quote, and I was hoping you would touch on that because you touched on that briefly in the book. And I think it's something that people need to realize is it doesn't mean right or wrong, but what it means is that if you're not doing that thing right now, or if you're not making time for it, then it's not a priority right now. And it doesn't mean that it might not be a priority a week or a month down the road, but it's something that I think is really important that people understand, because your actions dictate what your priorities are. So I'm glad you touched on that.
Yes, exactly.
So what's the best way for our listeners to connect with you, both for your books and your blog, but also if you could just tell us again where they could find your two podcasts also?
Yeah, so please come visit my website, which is lauravanderkam.com, just my name. I blog about 4 times a week there, so you can always read new content and find out more about my books, and also about the two podcasts, Before Breakfast and Best of Both Worlds. But those are available on iTunes or wherever else you get your podcasts.
Awesome. And then the last question I wanted to ask you, if there's any parting words you'd like to leave with our listeners.
I would encourage people, we talked a little bit about time tracking, but I encourage people to give it a whirl, because when you know where the time goes, then you can spend your time better. Or at least, be aware of what the contours of your life look like. And then often within that, you can start to see possibilities.
I love it. I love the word possibilities. And I truly, truly want to just say thank you very much for spending the time with us today. I definitely would recommend your new book to our listeners, as well as them checking out your podcast and your website. So thank you so much for the time with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to episode number 195. Laura Vanderkam's expertise, I believe, really fits with our no quit mission. One thing Laura mentioned was something that I work on and recommend to my own clients: the importance of tracking your time. Laura suggests to do this exercise for a week and to be diligent with it. Laura referenced possibilities as an exciting way to look at the future. When we discussed quotes, Laura shared one that I absolutely love. She said that "I don't have time" really means it's not a priority. In her new book, she also references that we always have time for what matters. I would like to challenge our listeners today to try the exercise of tracking your time for one entire week. Don't do it for a day or two, but instead do it for 7 straight days, and be honest with yourself and analyze that information. As we end today's episode, I would like to suggest for our listeners to look at your own actions. What you say might not actually align with what you do. And remember, as you go for your greatness today, make time for those things and people that truly matter to you. And lastly, to our listeners, thank you. We truly appreciate your time, and we hope our episodes inspire you to keep on attacking life and never giving up. To quote Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, it's always too early to quit.